During a family feast, my son-in-law threw a defiant line. "Your throne is a toilet, old king. Sit down and get out of the way." The guests laughed delighted with his humor, but I, the old king, just smiled, got up and made one call. 30 minutes later, a knock came to the door, and he was on his knees pleading with me to call it off. But by then, there was nothing I could do. I shoved my chair back from the table, its legs biting into the hardwood floor. Wine glass catching afternoon light, streaming through sheer linen curtains. Turkey bones were strewn across the white tablecloth like wreckage left on a battlefield. Gravy congealing in ceramic boats between half-empty beer bottles. Friends, I want to tell you an old joke about a king who, "Your throne is a toilet, old king. Sit down and don't interfere." Derek's voice sliced clean through my sentence like a knife through still air. The whole dining room exploded. Welcome to Dad's Revenge. I'm glad you're here with me today. If stories like this one speak to something deep in you, I'd be grateful if you'd hit like and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Before we begin, I'd love to know, what are you hoping to carry with you from today's story? Drop it in the comments when you're done. One more thing, some elements of this story have been shaped and dramatized for the purpose of storytelling. Any resemblance to real people or events is entirely coincidental. It's the message underneath that I want you to take home. Yves Lorraine bent forward, clutching her pearls, barely able to catch her breath between waves of laughter. Howie slapped the table so hard his water glass jumped. Nadine was mopping tears off her cheeks while Garrett applauded like he'd witnessed a standing ovation. "Oh my goodness, Derek, you're a genius." Lorraine wheezed, her face gone scarlet. "Funniest thing I've heard all year," Howie bellowed, hoisting his wine glass high. "Brilliant, absolutely brilliant." Nadine managed, still dissolving into giggles. I stood there with my mouth open, the sentence I'd started evaporating before it could form. Derek sank back in his chair, wine-flushed triumphant drinking, in the adulation the way dry ground drinks rain. Malicious pleasure lit his eyes as he watched me rooted to the spot. Claire sat rigid beside him, her gaze darting anxiously between her husband and me. Her fork moved in small, nervous circles above her plate, but not a word crossed her lips. My daughter has always tried to hold the peace, always counted on trouble passing, before anyone had to choose a side. I stood there through 3 full seconds that stretched like taffy. The laughter just kept coming. Derek topped off his glass with the loose, careless pour of a man who owns the room. He'd located his crowd, and they were entirely his. "Gerald, lighten up," Howie called, still grinning. "It's Thanksgiving, everybody tells jokes." "Derek is just so sharp," Lorraine chimed in, pressing a napkin to the corners of her eyes. "You really did raise a funny one, Claire." Claire's smile was stage-set, nothing behind it. She knew. The temperature in that room had shifted, and she felt it even if no one else did. 20 years of quiet retirement, 20 years of showing up to holidays as nothing more than a grandfather with a carving knife, and people forget. I hadn't. I eased back down into my chair, taking my time about it. I arranged my expression into something that might pass for amusement from across the table. Somewhere beneath the surface, something cold woke up something that had been lying still for a very long time. "Quite the performance, Derek," I said, soft and even. He raised his glass my direction, still riding the high of what he'd just pulled off. Around us, everyone drifted back to side conversations, plates circling, glasses getting topped. The whole episode was already crystallizing into a story they'd tell at the next gathering. I wrapped my fingers around my wine stem, hand rock steady, even as something burned behind my breastbone. Derek had just made the worst miscalculation of his life, and he was sitting there grinning about it. The clapping had barely faded when Nadine leaned forward, practically glowing. "Hey, Derek, you are on a roll tonight. How do you just come up with that stuff?" He pulled himself up in his seat chest, outface deepening another shade. Could have been the wine, could have been the applause. Hard to say. "It's a gift, I suppose. Either you've got it or you don't." He flicked a glance my way, slow, deliberate, the smirk of someone who's decided the fight is already won. The others caught it and laughed along, happy to play audience to his swagger. "Don't let it sting Gerald," Howie said, wagging his fork. "He's just having fun. Derek keeps things lively, that's all." "Oh, absolutely," Lorraine bobbed her head. "Remember last Christmas, that impression of the meter reader? I nearly choked on my mulled cider." They kept piling on the praise, each compliment inflating him a little more. He sat taller, laughed louder, poured sloppier. A dark red splash bloomed across the white cloth as he overfilled his glass. Claire touched his arm. "Derek, enough." Barely a whisper. "Relax, everyone's fine." He waved her off with a broad sweep of his hand. "It's just a good time. We're all enjoying ourselves, aren't we?" He swept his eyes around the table, tallying up the smiles. I kept cutting my turkey, even strokes, clean edges. Nothing about my posture gave a single thing away. But behind the calm, the machinery had already started turning dark shapes, assembling themselves on the horizon of my thoughts. Garrett eased back and rubbed his stomach. "This is exactly why I love getting everyone together. Great food, great laughs, great people." He nodded toward Derek. "Better entertainment than anything you'd find on television." "Hear, hear," Howie lifted his glass. "To Derek, our man of the hour." "To Derek," the table answered, crystal ringing against crystal. My son-in-law soaked it all up, like a lizard stretched out on sun-warmed concrete. This was his moment, the spotlight he couldn't buy with the card games he kept losing. For a few minutes, he was the man at the head of the table, and I was just the old relic he'd knocked aside with a punchline. Claire's unease became harder to hide with every new toast. She moved food from one side of her plate to the other, eyes traveling a worn path between Derek and me. She knew her father's silences well enough to tell the difference between surrender and stillness. This was stillness. "You should take that act on the road." Nadine offered her own hand, trembling on her glass from laughing so hard. "Maybe I will," Derek said, his voice, carrying now filling the room. "Lord knows I've got enough material." He let his eyes slide over to me once more. The conversation kept moving around me. I was the stone. It was the current. I cataloged everything who laughed hardest, what he said, how he said it. Derek thought tonight was a victory. He hadn't the faintest notion what he'd actually set loose. I laid my napkin on the table and pushed back my chair without hurrying. The others were too deep in Derek's orbit to pay me much attention. He was into another anecdote now, wine glass swooping through the air for emphasis. "Pardon me," I said, just loud enough to carry to every corner of the room. "There's a call I have to make." Derek's head came up, eyes shining with fresh ammunition. "The king must be summoning his coachman." Another explosion from the table. Lorene actually snorted, slapping a hand over her mouth. "Derek, stop! I genuinely cannot breathe. Wouldn't want to keep the royal court waiting," Howie said, fluttering his fingers in a languid royal wave. I gave a mild nod, as though I were acknowledging applause rather than swallowing ridicule. "Won't be long." Claire's eyes followed me out, worry written plainly across her face, but she held her tongue. She understood that speaking up would only pour fuel on it. Her silence cost her, I could see that. But it was the price she chose to pay. The warmth of the dining room fell away the moment I stepped into the hallway's quiet shadows. Derek's voice followed me, riffing now on royal plumbers and golden fixtures. The table roared. I slid open the side table drawer and found my phone pulling up the name I needed. Roy Denton. Roy, my old partner. The single person in the world who still knew who Gerald Harmon had been before retirement turned him into just another old man at the holiday table. 2 rings, and then his gravelly voice came through. "Gerald, is that you?" "Hello, Roy." My voice dropped low. "I need a favor. 20 years gone and now you're calling. This ought to be interesting." The alertness in his tone was immediate, the old instinct surfacing fast. "Talk to me." Another round of laughter rolled out from the dining room. Derek was flying now, feeding off my empty chair. "Let him. Let them all." "My son-in-law," I said. "The boy has no manners. The one who gambles carries paper with Bruno's people." "That's him." Roy took a breath, thinking it through. He was always good at reading the space between words. "How permanent are we talking?" "Permanent enough that it lands," I said. "Nothing that points back toward a family holiday." "Done. Timeline." I tilted my head toward the dining room, where Derek's voice rode above the rest, drunk on wine and borrowed glory. "Soon. Make the calls. Standard arrangement. Money's no object. It's good to hear your voice, Gerald, even under these circumstances." I tucked the phone away and pushed the drawer shut. A moment just standing there in the hallway's quiet shadows with the noise of their celebration pressing through the walls. They were convinced they'd seen something funny tonight. They had no idea they'd just watched the curtain go up on something else entirely. Back in the dining room, Derek was mid-story, hands moving. He clocked me coming in, and the smirk slid right back into place. "That was fast, Your Highness. Urgent dispatches from the throne room." The table obliged him with more laughter, more encouragement, more slack in the rope. I pulled out my chair, sat down, and picked up my fork. "Old business," I said. "Nothing pressing." But that was a lie. The pressing had already been done. 25 minutes went by, mostly quiet. Derek coasted on the evening's momentum, landing a few smaller jokes that kept the table warm. I barely moved fork to plate to mouth eyes drifting to my watch at measured intervals. 4:09, 4:10. The doorbell sounded. The corner of my mouth moved barely, just enough. Roy had never once been late. Looks like the old king ordered himself a cab. They're all laughing now, every last one of them. But before I tell you what that laughter is about to set in motion and what it will cost, the man who thought he'd won the room, let me ask you this. If someone you loved used you as a punchline in front of a crowd, would you answer them in the moment, or would you let silence do the work? Derek's voice still carried that familiar mocking edge, though it had softened with wine and self-satisfaction. The drinking had made him loose, careless. "Derek," I said, evenly setting my fork down. "Would you get the door, please?" He looked briefly caught off guard, then a fresh gleam of opportunity crossed his face. Another stage, another audience. "Of course, Your Majesty." He shoved back from the table with theatrical flair, wobbling slightly where the wine and his own center of gravity disagreed. Lorene giggled. "Always the gracious host answering doors for mysterious guests." "Probably a delivery guy," Nadine offered. "People work every holiday now." Derek tugged his shirt straight and sauntered toward the foyer like a man who'd just inherited the earth. Each step carried him further from where he ought to be, though he had no way of knowing that. To him, this was simply another opening, one more chance to outshine the old man he'd left sitting at the table. Claire tracked her husband's movement, then her gaze cut back to me. My stillness was unnerving her. She could read a room the way sailors read weather, even when she couldn't name what was coming. "Gerald," she said softly, leaning close. "Who'd be calling on Thanksgiving?" "An old friend." I said, eyes fixed on the foyer where Derek's confident footsteps rang off the hardwood. I didn't look at her. Around us the rest of the table carried on, no one paying the interruption much mind. Howie was telling Garrett about his new fishing gear. Lorene was asking Nadine for her cranberry sauce recipe. Holiday conversation, the comfortable, forgettable kind that makes people feel like nothing in the world could disturb them. From the foyer came the faint scrape of Derek's hand, finding the knob, then the metallic snap of the lock turning. A few more seconds, and everything he thought he knew would shift under his feet. 20 years of careful quiet, 20 years of letting people believe Gerald Harmon was nothing more than a grandfather with a carving fork was about to be over. The door swung open, Derek's voice still carrying the last echoes of his earlier bravado. "Hello there, can I help you?" Then nothing. Complete loaded silence. Even from where I sat in the dining room, I felt the air change. The pause stretched past, comfortable, past, polite. Howie trailed off mid-sentence about his fishing gear. Lorene's fork hung suspended halfway to her mouth. "Everything okay out there?" Nadine called toward the foyer. Derek said nothing back, but I knew precisely what was unfolding. Roy was introducing himself quiet and professional, making the nature of this visit unmistakable without raising his voice. Derek was probably staring at three men who'd walked straight out of the debt collection nightmares that had been haunting his sleep for months. The kind of men who didn't accept installment plans or tearful excuses. "Maybe someone should check on him," Claire murmured, already half out of her chair. "Sit," I said low, but with enough weight that she stopped cold. "He'll be back." My watch read 4:12, right on schedule. Through the dining room archway, I could make out Derek's silhouette framed against the frosted glass of the front door. Every line of his body had changed, shoulders drawn up, neck forward, like a man trying to decipher news he couldn't make himself believe. "Good afternoon, Derek." Roy's voice reached me clearly, steady as a metronome. "I'm Roy. We need a word." Derek's answer was a strangled rasp. "I don't follow. Who are you?" "A friend of your father-in-law. Step outside." Those words landed on him like something physical. The hand braced against the doorframe began to shake where we could all see it. He threw a look back toward the dining room, face drained white. Claire pushed halfway up again. "Derek, what's going on?" "Everything's fine, sweetheart." Derek's voice fractured on the last word. Just a bit of business. 1 minute." His body told the true story. He moved like a condemned man taking his last walk, pulling himself reluctantly across the threshold and out of sight. The front door stayed open behind him, letting a blade of cold November air slice into the house. "Odd," Howie said, reaching for his wine. "Who drops by on Thanksgiving?" Lorene tugged her cardigan tighter. "Should we shut that door? There's a chill coming in." "Leave it," I said. Claire's eyes locked onto mine, trying to find something I wasn't offering yet. She could feel that something was very wrong, but the picture hadn't assembled itself for her. Her husband had just stepped outside with men who knew her father, and that father was sitting here calmly finishing his meal. "Gerald," she pressed, voice low and urgent. "Who are those men? What is this? Old associates?" I said, trimming another slice of turkey with the same even hand I might use to sign a document. "Nothing that concerns you." But concern was precisely what she ought to feel. Out there, Derek was being educated about consequences, about the kind of debt that doesn't sit quietly, about the category of people who don't negotiate with charm and promises. Roy would be laying it out cleanly in plain language, leaving no room for Derek to convince himself he'd misunderstood. Lenny and Sal wouldn't need to say a word. Standing there was sufficient. Their presence translated everything. "Has Derek had a gambling problem long?" Nadine asked, barely above a murmur, as though she'd been holding the question all evening. The table went still. Everyone had been thinking it. No one had wanted to say it. Claire's color rose, which answered the question before her mouth did. "He doesn't gamble," she said, but the words had no backbone. "Come on, Claire," Garrett said, not unkindly. "The moods, the money pressure, all those sure things and lucky breaks he's always talking about, we've noticed." She looked around the table and saw that her husband's secret had never been a secret at all. It's just small stuff. Friends playing cards." I kept eating. I let it play out. Let them work through what they could on their own. Before long, the full picture would surface, whether anyone willed it to or not. The front door closed with a soft click that moved through the house like the sound of something final. Derek's footsteps returning across the hardwood were nothing like the ones that had carried him out. No swagger now, just the halting hollow tread of a man whose legs had forgotten their purpose. He filled the dining room archway and stood there looking as though the last decade had hit him all at once. Face the color of ash sweat, beating on his forehead in spite of the November cold. His hands shook badly enough that he had to grip the frame to keep upright. "Derek!" Claire moved to stand and stopped when she saw his face. The rest of the table stared at what had come back through that door, in place of the man who left. The wine-warm swagger was gone without a trace. So was the performer's gleam. What stood there instead was someone who just looked over a ledge and found it had no bottom. His eyes crossed the room and found mine. In them was total comprehension. Roy had been thorough, not just the debt, but who had the means to bury it, or bury him. "Gerald," he said, barely a sound. I glanced up from my plate with the mild expression of a man who'd simply noticed someone had returned. "Yes, Derek." He crossed the room in 3 unsteady strides, then his legs gave out entirely. He went down to his knees beside my chair, with a sound like something snapping both hands extended toward me. "Father!" Derek croaked, the word torn from his throat like a confession. "Forgive me. I didn't mean any of it. It was a joke, just a stupid joke. Call them off. Please!" Shocked gasps broke around the table. A confused murmur spread through the room. Lorene's wineglass slipped from her hand and shattered against her plate. Howie lurched back so fast his chair crashed to the floor behind him. "Derek!" Claire scrambled around the table. "What happened? Talk to me." But Derek's entire world had contracted down to one point: me. He knelt there, a man unmade, appealing for mercy from the grandfather he'd humiliated in front of an audience not 3 hours before. Tears cut lines through the sweat on his face. "Please," he said, "I'll fix it. I'll get up in front of everyone and apologize. I'll never speak to you that way again. Just make them stop." I set my fork down with care and looked at him from my chair. The geometry of it said everything that needed saying: king and supplicant weight and weightlessness. The table watched in stunned silence, trying to square this wreckage with the glittering performance they had applauded earlier. "Call who off, Derek?" I asked, my voice quiet. "You know who." His voice came apart entirely. "Roy, those men outside? They said you could make all of this disappear, or make it so much worse." Claire reached her husband and dropped to her knees beside him, her own face going pale as the full shape of it reached her. Gerald, what men? What is Derek talking about? I stayed in my seat regarding the ruin of my son-in-law's pride without any particular hurry. Outside Roy's car was in all likelihood already gone from the curb. The work was done, delivered cleanly, nothing wasted. I believe, I said, taking my time, Derek has something he'd like to say to all of us. The silence stretched like a taut wire trembling. I looked down at Derek, still shaking on his knees beside my chair, then let my gaze move slowly around the stunned faces at my table. Truth had been a long time coming. Derek, I said, letting the full weight of every year I'd lived settle into the word. Did you really think you could humiliate me in front of my family and there'd be no reckoning you forgot who you were talking to? A sob caught in his throat. I didn't know. You didn't want to know. I lifted my wineglass hand, steady movements, calm and deliberate. You preferred the comfortable fiction, just a harmless old man, good for a punchline, and nothing else. Claire's face had gone pale as a winter sky. She knew exactly where this road led, having heard enough about my old life to fill in the rest. Dad, please. I knew about your debts, Derek. The words landed in that room like stones dropped into still water. Not bank debts. Real debts. Lorene's hand flew to her mouth. Nadine seized Garrett's arm hard enough that her knuckles went white. Howie sat motionless, his overturned chair still on the floor behind him. Derek's head jerked up, fresh terror in his eyes. How could you possibly know that? Because threats to my family are things I make it my business to know. I took a measured sip of wine and let that settle. Did you imagine your gambling was invisible? The midnight call's the way you go rigid every time an unknown number lights up your screen. Gerald, Claire whispered, fingers closing on my arm. Please, stop. But stopping wasn't an option, not anymore. 20 years of quiet retirement had come to an end the moment Derek decided I was his entertainment for the evening. He understood what he was getting into when he borrowed from those people, Claire. He made those choices himself. I'll fix it. Derek's voice cracked wide open. I'll get the money together somehow. I just need more time. I looked down at him with something close to pity. Time, Derek, you've had months to address this. Instead, you doubled down, borrowed more, placed bigger bets with money that was never yours to lose. The guests sat locked in place, watching this unfold the way people slow down to look at wreckage on the road. They had arrived expecting turkey and pleasant table talk. What they were witnessing instead was the undoing of everything they thought they understood about the Harmon family. I've had my eye on your schemes for a good while now. I continued, my voice never climbing past a conversational register. The invented business opportunities you pitched to Claire's friends, the carefully rehearsed stories about temporary cash flow. But tonight crossed a line. Derek opened his mouth and closed it again, nothing coming out but a hollow sound. Claire's tears had started. Understanding was arriving in full, the realization that her father wasn't posturing or threatening. He was showing her something he had never entirely put away. Respect, I said, turning my attention to the full table, isn't a thing you can collect back once you've scattered it on the floor. Derek forgot that tonight. Outside, a car engine turned over and pulled smoothly away from the curb. Roy departing as quietly as he'd come, his part of the work complete. Derek heard it too. He flinched like a man feeling the first shovel of dirt. Now, I said, setting my wineglass down with finality, we discuss what comes next. I shifted my gaze to Claire, and something in my voice came down a degree or two. The hardest part of any lesson is accounting for the people you love most. Dad, he's made mistakes, but he's still my husband. He's still family. Is he? I asked it simply, no drama in it. Because family shields each other. Family doesn't turn each other into the evening's entertainment. Derek tried to lift his head from where he knelt, voice barely surfacing above a whisper. I'll fix it. Give me a little time. I'll get the money together. More time won't repair what's wrong with your character, Derek. My eyes stayed on Claire. Your husband owes $60,000 to people who don't do payment plans. But that's not what we're really here about. Nadine made a small, sharp sound. $60,000, more than most at that table pulled down in a full year. The number hung in the room like smoke from a funeral pyre. Gerald, Claire pleaded, both hands wrapped around my arm. Whatever you're planning, don't. Not tonight. Not on Thanksgiving, not with everyone here. I laid my hand over hers and felt how cold they'd gone. I'm not planning anything, sweetheart. It's already done. Her face folded when that landed. The phone call. He knew exactly what those people were when he took their money. I said each word placed with care. He understood the terms. He chose to go in anyway. Derek's breathing had turned shallow, frantic. Claire, tell him. Tell him I'll change. No more gambling. I'll go get help. I'll do whatever he wants. But I'd heard these exact promises before in pieces through the walls during his late-night calls to whoever was waiting on the other end of those debts. They were the words of a man who'd already proved he couldn't back them up. Your husband has been living 2 lives, I told Claire quietly. Secret debts, failed schemes, one layer of lies stacked on another. And tonight, he decided to make me the butt of his act. Lorene and Howie traded a horrified look across the table. This was nothing like the dinner they'd come for. This was something rawer than their tidy suburban lives had taught them to handle. I've been watching him for months, I went on, waiting to see whether he'd find his way back to being the man you chose. Instead, he got bolder, sloppier, more reckless. Claire's sobs shook her entire body. But you're not going to, you wouldn't hurt him. Who said anything about hurting him? I asked, and I meant the question genuinely. The relief that broke across Derek's face was almost pitiful. He'd been constructing the worst possible ending in his head, and my question had just swung a door open onto something he hadn't let himself hope for. There are many ways to teach a man respect, I said, rising from my chair for the first time since the crisis had begun. Death is the least imaginative of them. I walked toward the front door, leaving them all suspended in the dining room between terror and fragile hope. There were terms to be worked out, terms that could satisfy every competing need at the table. Derek's survival, my standing, Claire's peace of mind. The front door opened before I reached for the handle. Roy stood on the porch, Lenny and Sal positioned on either side of him like professional shadows. 3 decades of working together meant a glance could carry what most people needed, a conversation to deliver. How long does he need? Roy asked, no preamble. A week, I said. This is a lesson, not a punishment. Roy nodded, once absorbing the distinction. Bruno's people won't hold indefinitely. They will if you ask them to. I stepped onto the porch and pulled the door shut behind me, keeping our conversation where it belonged. Tell them Gerald Harmon is personally guaranteeing this debt gets resolved inside 7 days. If it doesn't, Derek gets a harder education. I glanced back toward the house where my family waited in terrified stillness. But Claire doesn't need to be part of what comes after. Lenny shifted his weight slightly, the first movement I'd seen from him all night. Even a man who communicates through presence alone understands what it means when certain names get invoked in certain conversations. Debts can be postponed, restructured, absorbed. Respect cannot be borrowed. 7 days, Roy confirmed. From now, I said. Not from tonight. He's had months to handle this on his own. Now he gets 1 week with the right kind of incentive. Through the window, I could see Derek still on his knees on the dining room floor. Claire hovering over him, the guests frozen in place like animals that have scented something dangerous nearby. Thanksgiving dinner had become something none of them would be telling as a funny story. Roy put out his hand and I shook it. Good to see you functioning again, Gerald, even if just for the evening. Just for the evening, I agreed. This is about family, nothing else. The 3 of them walked back to their car without any hurry, the way men do when they have nothing left to prove. The engine started and they moved off into the November dark. Ordinary suburban sounds came back in distant traffic. A neighbor's dog, the low hum of a heating unit, somewhere clicking on against the cold. I went back inside and drew the door shut behind me. The click moved through the house like a judge's gavel, announcing a verdict. 7 pairs of eyes found me the moment I stepped back into the dining room. Derek looked up from the floor where he was still kneeling, desperate hope doing battle with whatever terror still lived in his chest. You've been given a reprieve, I said, settling back into my chair with the same unhurried calm I'd held all evening. 1 week, Derek's sob of relief filled the room. Thank you. I swear I'll make it right. I'll fix all of it. Promises are exactly what got you here, I reminded him. Results are the only thing that will get you out. Claire helped her husband to his feet. He swayed for a moment, body still reeling from the violent swing between certain ruin and unexpected mercy. 7 days, I said again, making sure the terms were clear to everyone present. After that, the problem belongs to someone else. The guests were still making sense of the fact that their host was not the harmless retiree they'd assumed he was. Derek nodded rapidly, scrubbing the tears and sweat from his face. I understand. 7 days. I'll find a way. I picked up my fork and turned back to my turkey. Good. Now shall we finish our dinner? No one moved for a solid 30 seconds. The invitation to simply continue the meal drifted over the table like smoke rising from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. Lorene broke the silence, first reaching for her purse with movements so deliberate they looked rehearsed. Actually, Gerald, she said, her voice climbing a half register higher than normal, I think we really ought to be heading out. It's getting late and Howie has work in the morning. Howie was already on his feet nodding before she'd finished the sentence. Early meeting, you know how it is. The departure unfolded in a current of polite murmurs and uneasy smiles. Nadine gathered her sweater, while Garrett rose too fast, sending his napkin sliding to the floor. Nobody reached for it. The ordinary choreography of leaving had been replaced by something closer to an exit, everyone pretending it wasn't. I hope everything turns out all right, Lorene breathed to Claire as they moved toward the foyer, the words barely carrying heavy with what she wasn't asking. Claire held her hostess expression together, despite the shock still sitting behind her eyes. Of course, just family business. But none of them knew, and that was the precise weight of the problem. They'd seen the mild-mannered grandfather become someone whose power they couldn't fit into any category they had available. Derek stood on unsteady legs, jacket draped over one arm like a white flag. His hands shook as he tried to put it on a task that suddenly required more coordination than he possessed. I'll head home now, he said, directing it at me. Thank you for the opportunity. I glanced up from my plate fork still in hand. 1 week, Derek. The words hit him like something solid. His shoulders dropped under the deadline's weight. He gave a single nod, then followed the others toward the door with the gait of a man moving through water. Claire moved back and forth between the foyer and the dining room, torn between her hosting duties and the pull to stay near me. She helped with coats and offered parting pleasantries, but her attention kept floating back to where I sat, finishing my meal, calm as if the evening had been entirely unremarkable. Thank you for having us, Nadine said, though her voice had the texture of someone relieved to be going rather than grateful for having come. Drive safe, Claire answered by reflex. Car doors shut in the driveway. Engines caught with unusual speed. Within 5 minutes, a house that had been ringing with laughter stood nearly hollow, holding nothing but the smell of turkey and the mass of unfinished things. Derek was the last to go lingering in the doorway, like a man afraid to step out but equally afraid to stay. The cars, he said abruptly. I'll start with the cars. Good thinking, I said, without raising my eyes from the plate. Claire closed the door behind him and leaned back against it, the composure she'd been holding finally giving way. What happened tonight? Dad. I set my fork down and looked at my daughter. Really looked. She deserved honesty, but not the kind that would leave her staring at the ceiling for a month. Your husband learned some manners, I said. And our guests learned that family dinners can carry their own kind of education. The Chicago cafe hummed with afternoon energy. Business professionals hunched over laptops beneath the shadow of gleaming high-rises. I picked a corner table back to the wall, old instincts from an old life, and watched the entrance while sipping dark roast coffee. Derek arrived exactly on time. That alone told me something had shifted. A man who'd spent months dodging creditors and manufacturing excuses had discovered punctuality inside 7 days. He looked thinner, worn at the edges, but he moved differently now. The swagger that had been covering his desperation was gone. Gerald, he said, approaching with measured steps. Thank you for agreeing to see me. I gestured toward the chair across from me. You said it was important. He sat and placed a manila folder on the table between us. I wanted to thank you in person and to show you what I managed this week. He opened the folder and spread out documents like an accountant presenting a full audit, car titles, bank transfer receipts, a jeweler's appraisal for his Rolex stock liquidation paperwork. Had to let go of the cars, the Rolex some stock positions I'd been holding. He said, voice level, in spite of what those words represented. Not easy, but I covered everything. I went through the papers without comment, noting the thoroughness of his documentation. 2 vehicles sold under market value for speed. The watch, a graduation gift from Claire, surrendered for less than half what it was worth at retail. Investments, broken early penalties absorbed. The debts, paid in full. He laid out the final payment confirmations, each one stamped and signed by people who didn't typically put things in writing. Bruno's associates were professional about it. They mentioned your name. The weight of that settled across the table between us. My reputation had walked into rooms I hadn't entered in 20 years and still carried enough gravity to turn Derek's death sentence into a solvable problem. You pulled me back from something much worse. Derek went on, dropping his voice beneath the cafe noise. I know what the other outcome would have looked like. The important thing is the lesson landed, I said, pushing the papers back toward him. Respect isn't only in what you say, Derek. It lives in what you choose to do. He nodded, a faint tremor in his hands as he gathered the documents. I understand that now. Learned it the hard way. But I understand it. Steam lifted from my coffee cup while I took a measure of the man sitting across from me. 7 days ago, he'd been a gambling addict running out of borrowed time and other people's money. Sitting here now was someone who'd walked into consequences and come out the other side. Claire doesn't know the specifics, he said, reading what I hadn't voiced: the amounts, the people, the nature of what had been negotiated. She knows we talked, that it's settled. Good. I leaned back and let my gaze drift to the office workers moving past the floor-to-ceiling windows. Some weight is better carried by one set of shoulders. Derek folded his hands on the table. The manila folder lay closed beside his coffee. Outside, Chicago kept its pace. But in our corner of that cafe, time sat still between confession and something that might become absolution. No more gambling, no more debts. He said each word placed with intention. I know exactly how close I came to losing everything, not just the money, Claire, the family, every single thing that actually matters. I looked at his face, searching for the man who'd mocked me across the dinner table 7 days before. That version of him seemed to have been stripped away along with the possessions, leaving someone more stripped down, if more honest. Good, I said. Family comes first, Derek, before everything. Family before everything. He repeated the way a man repeats something he means to carry. Claire doesn't need the details about this week, the sales who I had to deal with. She'll be glad we've put it behind us. That should be enough. The sense in that caught me off guard. Derek had learned more than how to respect people. He'd absorbed something about protection, about what you keep quiet and why. Some lessons can't be delivered by words or by fear. You have to live them before they take hold. She'll be glad, I agreed. Claire always felt the weight of the space between us. She loves us both, which meant she was the one getting pulled in two directions. Derek's smile was rueful but genuine. I made it that way. I thought you were just another obstacle I could maneuver around. I forgot that you're her father before anything else, and that means something. Through the window, I watched a father and young daughter walking hand in hand down the sidewalk heading towards Millennium Park. The girl pointed at something out of my sightline, her whole body lit up with it, and her father looked down at her the way fathers do. The small moments. They outlast everything else. The gambling wasn't really about money, Derek said without being prompted. It was about feeling like I had control over something. But when you're playing inside someone else's game with someone else's rules, that feeling is a lie. I nodded. I understood more than he realized. Real control comes from knowing your edges and not pretending they aren't there. Exactly. He put his hand out across the table. I'd like to start fresh if you're open to it. Not as the son-in-law who made a mess of things. As family. I looked at his hand a moment, then took it. Firm grip. No shaking it, no fear pushing through. Just a man making good on his word. Family, I said. He gathered the folders, stood, and pulled on his jacket. Not the expensive coat he'd worn to Thanksgiving, but something plainer, more functional. Every unnecessary thing had been shed. Thank you, Gerald, for everything, including the parts that weren't easy. I stayed in my seat and watched through the glass as he came out onto the sidewalk below and folded into the crowd. Just another person in a city that never stops moving, carrying his lessons now, instead of his debts. My phone buzzed. A message from Claire. Dad, Derek said you two talked and got things worked out. Thank you for giving him another chance. I wrote back. He earned it. The Chicago skyline filled the window beyond steel and glass, climbing toward winter clouds. That Thanksgiving table went quiet in a way none of them expected when the evening started. And I'll be honest, I didn't enjoy what had to happen, but some lessons can only be learned one way. I had spent 20 years becoming invisible on purpose, becoming the grandfather who carved the turkey and stayed out of everyone's way. And in one careless moment, Derek reminded me that the man I used to be never fully left. What it cost him, the cars, the Rolex, the stocks, his pride, none of that was what I was after. What I wanted was for my daughter to stop carrying the weight of a husband living a double life. I believe God put certain things in motion at exactly the right moment, and that Thanksgiving, as ugly as it got, was one of those moments. The truth came out because it needed to. If this family revenge story taught me anything worth passing along, let me leave you with this. First, never let comfort make you forget who you are. The people who underestimate you are counting on your silence. Second, respect is not something you can take back once you've thrown it away in front of witnesses. Third, real strength isn't in the threat, it's in knowing you'll never need to raise your voice to be heard. Fourth, when someone you love is drowning in secrets, the kindest thing you can do is make the truth unavoidable. If this story of Dad's revenge reached something in you today, I'd be glad if you shared it with someone who might need to hear it. A father, a daughter, anyone who knows what it means to be underestimated by their own family. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Dad's Revenge so the next story finds you, thank you for spending this time with me. Until next time, take care of the people at your table.